An agreement, a diplomatically reached agreement to reconstrain Iran's nuclear program is a very tough thing and is a good thing from a security point of view.
That's the voice of Jeremy Ben-Ami. Jeremy Ben-Ami is the president of J Street and the former deputy domestic policy advisor to President Clinton. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Tom Collina and Michelle Dover.
Thanks, Jacqueline, and welcome back to Press the Button. Michelle, great to see you. How was your weekend?
Oh, it was fantastic, Tom. I went up to Philadelphia actually to see some friends. And for all you listeners in Philadelphia, you guys have a great holiday market. Really, really cool. How was your weekend, Tom?
Hey, Michelle, it was great. And I love Philadelphia as well. My 3 kids are up there doing various colleges and graduate schools, so I'm up there all the time. And one of them, actually the one who's at Temple University, is back already, which is really nice. So my weekend was great, but we're having our own existential crisis about Christmas trees, where this particular child, who shall remain nameless, we discovered about 3 years ago they're allergic to, I guess, Christmas trees. I don't know. I didn't know there was such a thing. So we went 2 years without any Christmas tree at all, which we decided was not a good solution. So now we've really bitten the bullet and gone for a fake Christmas tree. And big change, never had a fake Christmas tree before in my life, going back to when I was, 0 years old. So this is a big change. We're doing our best, Michelle. We're doing our best. We're adjusting to it. Doesn't smell the same. I keep trying to convince myself it looks real. It doesn't, but we're doing our best.
Maybe it's not so much a fake Christmas tree as an everlasting Christmas tree.
Well, I'm trying to convince myself, right, this is the last Christmas tree I'll ever have to procure. But I'm not sure that makes me feel any better because I still miss the realness of the smell. And I even miss like the pine needles falling off and getting stuck in the rug. I don't know how to tell you. It is what it is. Anyway, turning to nuclear news, the Iran nuclear negotiations resumed last week, as our listeners know, in Vienna, and will continue into this week, and we'll discuss that more later in the podcast. And big news from the Korean Peninsula, South Korean President Moon Jae-in said Monday that he, along with the United States, North Korea, and China, have agreed in principle to declare a formal end to the Korean War. And this is a big deal because, as our listeners know, there's been no formal treaty ending the 1953 Korean War. So the South and the North are still technically at war, backed by the United States and China, respectively. And Moon said that the end of war declaration is not the ultimate goal, but would pave the way, he hopes, to restart talks on denuclearization. So we'll stay tuned to hopefully hear more good news coming from that. And Michelle, what do we have coming up on Early Warning?
Today we look ahead to the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, the NPT RevCon as it's informally called, that's coming up in January, and what we should all be watching for, including whether or not it's really going to have an impact on what we're seeing in terms of nuclear risk. So you don't want to miss it.
And then I sit down with Jeremy Ben-Ami. He's the president of J Street. And we discuss how a growing number of former Israeli security officials are publicly faulting the Israeli government for opposing the Iran nuclear deal. They're claiming that Trump's maximum pressure campaign has only served to move Iran closer to a bomb. So it's a great conversation. Please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. Today, I'm joined by Nomsa Ndongwe, Research Associate at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, Assistant Director of Global Recruiting at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, and co-founder of the WCAPS West Coast Chapter. She is joining us today in her personal capacity, so her comments and opinions do not represent CNS or Middlebury. Nomsa, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me. I'm a huge fan of this podcast, so this is exciting.
Well, as you know, we have 7 minutes to cover the week's nuclear and national security news starting now. Every 5 years, the Non-Proliferation Treaty undergoes a review conference in which states gather to push for progress on key non-proliferation and disarmament issues. Now, the April 2020 RevCon is finally happening in this January in 2022 after being rescheduled a couple times. What are the key issues facing states?
Thank you. So my first degree is in the law, so I always like to define my terms, and I always like to start with the bigger picture and then narrow in. So the first thing I will say is the Non-Proliferation Treaty is the cornerstone of the international non-proliferation regime. It has near universal membership, and it is basically the blueprint on everything that we do that has to do with international agreements regarding nuclear non-proliferation or nuclear disarmament. It came about in 1968 and entered into force in 1970 for those of y'all who are prepping for a pub quiz. And I think the most important thing to know is that we like to refer to it as a grand bargain, because it was an agreement where we had 5 countries in the world, which were the United States, Russia, the USSR at the time, China, France, and Great Britain, who were counted as nuclear weapon states, which means they're the ones who possess nuclear weapons. And then everybody else, the rest of the world, was going to be considered a non-nuclear weapon state. So what that means in context of the NPT is that you have these 5 countries who also happen to be the P5 in the United Nations system, who are the ones who are committing to getting rid of the nuclear weapons that they do have, while also trying to prevent anybody else from getting nuclear weapons. And there is a third pillar of the NPT that, depending on who you talk to, doesn't get enough attention, is the peaceful uses pillar, which was to say that it was this belief that nuclear energy can be harnessed for good and can be used for peaceful uses, whether that is electricity generation or treatment in hospitals for cancer patients. So what we're going to see is you're going to see the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states have very different expectations for the review conference, mainly because since the last review conference and the loads of acrimonious accusations that were thrown around as to who caused the conference to ultimately fail to achieve a consensus document, you have seen the Treaty Prohibiting Nuclear Weapons not only be advocated for, but drafted and come into force. So there is a very huge schism right now between the two sides. And the two sides get a little bit more complicated because not only do you have your P5 non-nuclear weapon states, but you also have what we call umbrella states, which are the countries that benefit from security agreements. So there is a divide between what the people who mainly argued for the Treaty Prohibiting Nuclear Weapons want and what the people who claim to be committed to their Article 6 obligations to disarm and get rid of all nuclear weapons, but believe that the environment or the conditions for that to happen are currently not conducive.
You mentioned that previous RevCons have failed in reaching some sort of consensus document or something that all states agree to of the issues they're going to work on and a path forward. What will you be watching for in this particular conference?
To be very honest with you, Michelle, I am of the belief that this conference would have been best held last year at the height of the pandemic, not because I wanted people to be exposing themselves to COVID in closed spaces, but because I feel as just a global society, we were very much more invested in the very human principles of togetherness and unity and solving problems as a unit. And I think that basically the political will would have been there to say, wow, we're facing a global pandemic, that we can be all decimated by this tiny microscopic unit. Let's see what we can do about this other great existential threat that is completely man-made. And I think that holding the conference at a time when we are witnessing all kinds of shenanigans, truly, from all different parts of the world with regard to weapons of mass destruction. And I'm a little bit skeptical that we will have that momentum that we would have had last year. However, I would be so thrilled to see the review conference reinforce or regain some sort of credibility, because I think that the conference as a whole is suffering a crisis of credibility. The countries that do not have nuclear weapons, who want nuclear disarmament to be the main issue that is under discussion, the main issue that is addressed, many countries do not feel like that has happened. They were unhappy with the results of the 2015 review conference, and everything that has happened globally since has sort of gone to entrench folks in camps. The one thing I will say, the good faith belief I have, is that I think everybody is definitely committed to trying to make the review conference something that is going to help, as opposed to be something that is going to count in the negative column. So I don't think that the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons is going to be the main bone of contention, but I think it's a great lens to look at how people are coming into the room without even looking at the infighting or the issues that countries have bilaterally or trilaterally in some situations. We know that there has been some alarming news about missiles and silos, and we know that there has been alarming news about spending and weapons modernization. And then we also have concerns, that have become more clear to us regarding cybersecurity issues and the question of how safe are the nuclear arsenals that exist in the world now that we know that people can use cyber technology to hack into systems. Those are some of the topics that I think are going to be of top of mind for people. So I think there is definitely going to be a crisis of expectation versus what people are going to get. And I definitely think, for me personally, as somebody who has witnessed nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation from a, first of all, member state perspective, and now that I'm not in the member state perspective, from an academic perspective, which is a really nice place to be in, I definitely think that there is a credibility crisis. What is the point if we can't agree on anything?
And leaning into that, ultimately, what impact do you expect this RevCon to have on rising nuclear threats?
Ooh, that's a tough question. I think the impact is going to depend on how seriously people are using the review conference as a litmus test for the state of affairs or where we are in the world. I personally think we already know where we stand in the world. We know there's so many things that are going on. I personally would love to see more connection between just the nuclear weapons threat, humanitarian consequences, also includes what happens if there is an accidental detonation, right? What happens if an explosion happens somewhere? So I definitely would suggest to your listeners to follow Reaching Critical Will, to follow Plowshares, to follow Michelle, to follow me, to follow my institute, the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, to keep abreast of what's going on and what we should think about those things.
Nomsa, our time has flown by too quickly. Thank you so much for the preview, and we look forward to hearing more.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Fisk, Deputy Director of Development at Plowshares Fund and a Press the Button listener. When I first joined Plowshares Fund back in 2018, I didn't know anything about nuclear weapons. I came here with just the motivation to help create a safer world and a commitment to lifelong learning. My colleagues told me they'd teach me everything I need to know, and did they ever? Still do, actually. As I continue to grow ever more committed to Plowshares Fund and the reduction and elimination of nuclear weapons, I found that I rely on Press the Button so much. It's a resource for the latest analysis and a place where I can drop in fully, without distractions, and gain new insight into this issue I've come to know and love. I find inspiration from the weekly guests and our partners, and I know I'm a better contributor to our cause just by tuning in. Please consider supporting Plowshares Fund and helping make Press the Button possible by making a donation today. Or make it a holiday gift and send one of our festive e-cards to someone in your life who is also passionate about the pursuit of a safe and secure future. Visit plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
Multilateral talks in Vienna to revive the Iran nuclear deal are bogged down, and there's a real chance that negotiations will fail. And if they do, we expect Iran's nuclear program to continue to accelerate as the United States and its partners maintain or expand their economic sanctions. And Iran is now much closer to having the ingredients for a nuclear bomb than it was before the Trump administration left the deal. From that perspective, the Trump administration's decision to leave the Iran deal in 2018 is not aging well. You might say it was one of the worst decisions in recent history. And that conclusion, that leaving the deal was a disaster, is now coming from an unexpected place, Israel. As our listeners will recall, former Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was one of Trump's main allies in opposing the Iran deal. But now a growing number of former Israeli security officials are publicly faulting the Israeli government for opposing the nuclear deal, claiming that Trump's maximum pressure campaign has only served to move Iran closer to a bomb. To help us understand how we got here and why top Israeli security experts are now criticizing government policy, we are joined by Jeremy Ben-Ami. He is the president of J Street, and he previously served as a deputy domestic policy advisor in the White House under President Clinton. Jeremy, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the talks in Vienna, which are clearly not going swimmingly. Do you think there's still hope for an agreement?
Well, the process of diplomacy is, as you know well, a very lengthy and up and down story, and many agreements and many sets of talks have looked very bleak before emerging out with something in the end that's part of the gamesmanship. And it's hard for us to penetrate from the outside exactly what the intentions are on the part of the Iranians and where this might well be next week. There was good news. We're recording this a couple of days before this may drop, and who knows what will happen in the next 4 days. But there's been good news in the last 24 hours that it seems that the Iranians came back to the round in Vienna this week. We're now talking on the 10th. The Iranians came back and walked back some of the things that they said at the prior week talks. And so you just don't know. And hope is probably not what we should be searching for. I think realist negotiators at the table should be looking for ways to ensure that both sides find that their interests are served by moving towards an agreement rather than moving away from it. And if that's the spirit, then perhaps there's a way to yes.
Fair enough. Let's focus on the situation coming out of Israel. Of course, as we know, Prime Minister Netanyahu supported President Trump's withdrawal from the deal. But now former officials have come out to criticize that move. Who are these people and what are they saying?
Well, I also want to just comment on the frame of the question, which is that Israel supported Trump's withdrawal. I think it's really important to understand that we probably wouldn't be in this mess if Benjamin Netanyahu hadn't pushed Republicans and pushed opponents of President Obama to adopt this as their policy. I'm not so sure that this would have turned into the debacle that it was if it hadn't been for the introduction of pressure from the prime minister into the American political equation that led to Trump adopting this position on the issue. It's not a given with him. There was no straight line in his foreign policy thinking. He liked to fancy himself a deal maker. You never know. And so it's not so much that Israel or Netanyahu in particular supported what Trump was doing. It's they pushed this to happen. And that's the tragedy of this whole situation. It's an active role that they played, not just a passive one. And former officials who are coming out in 2021 are joining the chorus of the officials who were in 2014 and 15 supportive of the deal. J Street worked with Plowshares very closely in that effort in those years to promote diplomacy and promote the JCPOA and ensure it survived the review in Congress. And one of the key things that we all did together was bring former Israeli security officials in 2015 to Washington, people who had held key roles but were now retired and free to speak their mind. They supported the deal. And that was one of the reasons that the deal survived congressional review, was because of the views of the Israeli security establishment. And we said at the time that these are former officials, but undoubtedly the current officials of 2015 would agree with them. But we didn't know that because they were in their official positions and the policy of Israel was set by the prime minister. But now all of those people are out of government. And they're the ones in 2021 coming forward and saying, what a disaster. There was no alternative. There was no plan B. And we're much worse off without the deal than with the deal, which is exactly what all of their respective former colleagues were saying in 2015. So this is not a surprise. This is common sense, right? You and I have worked on this long enough. It's not, to a certain extent, it is rocket science, but it's not rocket science. This is common sense policy. If you can put the Iranian nuclear program under a series of restraints with incredibly intrusive and thorough inspections, that's the ultimate outcome, right? And it's a tremendous deal. And we never really owned how good a deal it was. And now that it's not there, it looks really, really good compared to the current situation.
How senior are the people that are coming out now speaking out against the withdrawal from the deal? I mean, these are people that were at the highest levels of the security establishment. Isn't that right?
Well, you have some folks, like, let's say, a former defense minister came out this past week. You had former head of the Mossad. Some of these are at the absolute highest levels. But I think even more important, you have people who were the desk officers for the Iran file, within the Israeli military intelligence. I mean, the point people, you can say that people who were defense minister, they were politicians. And yes, that particular man was head of the IDF at one point, but not a day in, day out analyst studying what's happening and really understanding all the details. What's so significant about these people is they were actually the desk officers, the ones writing up the analysis that went up the chain. And their analysis was, this is a good deal and don't break it and don't push the US to get out of it. And that's who's coming out now. It's just fascinating. So it's up and down the chain of command. And it's clear that this was simply a political echelon decision led by Prime Minister Netanyahu and a couple of folks in his office to overrule the best judgment of the entirety, essentially, of the Israeli military establishment.
And from what you were saying before, this would not be that unusual, right? That officials would step down and then come out publicly criticizing previous or current government policy.
Well, I think one of the most fascinating things in the work that we all do for peace and for diplomacy is that some of our best validators are the folks who stepped out of military security and intelligence services after 20, 30 plus years in which their career has been focused on the use of force and making their militaries and their intelligence as capable as possible. And they emerge from that life experience recognizing that in general, there are no military solutions to political problems. And that is the frustration of their entire career is, they are working to put the best possible bandage and Band-Aid on wounds and problems that actually need, life-saving therapies. And it's, I'm sure, frustrating. And so this is not an uncommon trend. I work a lot on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the question of whether there's a way to find a resolution to the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians that's been raging for decades and decades. You find every single person who emerges from the security services there comes out and starts talking about the need for a political resolution and for a two-state solution and to sit down with the Palestinians and try to resolve the conflict. So it's the same thing here. And I find that in the US as well. Some of the best spokespeople for diplomacy and the importance of other tools in the toolkit are the folks who come out of the Pentagon and the Department of Defense.
Yes, for sure. Completely agree. What is your sense of why it seems all of these voices are coming out now? Is that just the impression we get, or is there really a concentration of views coming out at the same time?
Well, I do think we're at that critical moment. It is 11:59 on the JCPOA, and everything hangs in the balance. And the question of just how strongly the U.S. is going to make a push to get back in this deal. Folks are aware that this is a critical moment, and if things don't work out, then there comes a second critical moment, which is the choice of what do you do in the absence of a deal. And I think a lot of these folks also have spent plenty of time in game scenarios, understanding that there is no military actual option. You can rattle the sabers all you want, and you can, run all the exercises you want. But at the end of the day, a military strike on Iran is not in the best interest, the national security interests of the state of Israel. And I think that's why you're seeing a lot of this coming to a head right now.
So despite all of these powerful statements from former security officials, the new Israeli Prime Minister, Bennett, is still playing hardball, right? He's still taking a hardline position against Iran in the Iran negotiations. So do you think any of this recent public commentary will have an effect on Bennett's position, given this rising internal criticism?
I don't think it'll affect what he's saying politically. And, it goes back to this gap between what politicians say and what experts know. And politicians play to a much broader audience, an audience that generally is not that informed, that doesn't necessarily understand the nuance, doesn't get the long-term consequences of what may be feel-good short-term decisions. There's always this dynamic that you get 90% support in the first 24 hours of some form of military strike. And then when it turns into a 19-year war, you recognize that the public recognizes that maybe we should have thought twice about it. But that's sort of like human nature. If you go back to our roots, and who we are in our DNA, strike first and think later. And politicians play to that. And so it's not surprising. This is a new prime minister, about 6 months into his term, not particularly a strong political base, given how the Israeli government came to be. And he wants to look like he belongs in the job and looks strong and tough to a broader public. So he's going to have that kind of rhetoric. And we see that in American politics too. And unfortunately, often the expert voices are devalued. And what carries the day in the media and the political argument are some of these more hard-charged political voices.
And sort of right on cue as an example of that, we have the United States and Israel reportedly discussing possible military exercises that could target Iran's nuclear facilities if diplomacy fails, even though many of the experts we were just talking about are saying there really is no military option here. And so is this just more of the same, right? As you were saying, even though the experts, the people really in the know that the military strikes cannot be that effective, the politicians still sort of keep these out there for public consumption.
Well, I think there's a dual use here. I do think that even the best diplomats who really believe in diplomacy and understand conflict resolution will tell you that the rattling of a saber in the context of negotiations and, sort of keeping that option alive can influence negotiations and move them toward resolution if used appropriately. It would be probably not wise to rule out absolutely in the context of negotiations that there might ever be a scenario for military force. The question is, do the people in charge understand that that's exactly what they're doing? It's the same thing with sanctions. The sanctions are a useful tool if the purpose of the sanctions is to actually get a party to the table and make them realize that you're serious and move you towards diplomacy. But sanctions for punishment's sake, just for the sake of it, make no sense and they don't work. And, you won't topple a regime with sanctions and you're not going to find success with an actual military strike. And you just really have to hope that the team in Washington is experienced enough and pro-diplomacy enough. And we did just witness the president make a very tough and courageous decision to pull troops out of Afghanistan. And, the withdrawal didn't go smoothly, but it's the right strategic decision. And it's hard to do that, but he did it. It gives me some confidence that there's an understanding at the very top of this government that the military really is not the answer to these kinds of problems. But I'm not ruling out that, if you run a military exercise and you rattle the saber a little bit, it can convince the other side you're, serious and it's time to start really talking.
So last question, because we're running out of time. What is your hope for how these emerging views from Israeli security experts may change the current debate or may change the debate on these issues going forward?
Well, I hope that in the American context in particular, that, and again, hope is not something that I live by, but one can put it out there, that, perhaps in the coming months, there might be some form of agreement, whether it's a return to the JCPOA or some other form of agreement. It will then have to go to Congress. There will be a political vote. And my hope is that these voices are an effective part of the case to the senators and to the members of the House who have to vote on this, that in fact, an agreement, a diplomatically reached agreement to reconstrain Iran's nuclear program is a very tough thing and is a good thing from a security point of view. This is the way to achieve security. It's the way to show strength is through diplomacy. And here are all these array of Israeli military and security experts who are giving you the backing to take that tough vote.
Jeremy, we are running out of time, but I want to thank you so much for all your work and your partnership with Plowshares, and we wish you the best in your work going forward.
Thanks, Tom. Really appreciate the partnership that we have with Plowshares and all the work that you do.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett and Angela Kelly, and in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing from Delphine Vision, with research and assistance from Alex Hall, Harry Tarpey, and Desiree Zepetis. Audio engineering and sound design by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.